You're listening to Inside Israel Today with Gil Hoffman on the Land of Israel Network.
Hello and welcome to Inside Israel Today, here on the Land of Israel Network on thelandofisrael.com, where the Knesset is back in session after a long summer recess. The members of Knesset, unbeknownst to much of the public, did work hard during that time, and they do a lot when they're not in that plenum voting and speaking and everything. And with the Knesset coming back, though, it's very festive and very exciting. And I thought it's very important that we start off here on Inside Israel Today by speaking to a member of Knesset. We have on the line Sharren Haskel from the Likud. Thank you for coming here on Inside Israel Today.
Thank you very much for hosting me.
So Sharren, among the many things that she does in the Knesset, is the head of the Israel-Australia caucus and friendship league. And you can hear that she has a little bit of an Australian accent from spending some time over there.
Yeah, I spent 6 years in Australia.
Getting your veterinary degree, right? Yeah,
the veterinary nurse certificate.
Well, and that prepared you well to be a member of Knesset with all the animals that they have over there.
Absolutely. If you know how to handle animals, you'll do good in politics.
So the reason why we're bringing up Australia, we don't usually bring up Australia on the Land of Israel Network, it's not the Land of Australia Network, is that around 9 o'clock last night, we get a message from the Prime Minister's office praising Scott Morrison, the new Prime Minister for Australia, for saying that he would consider recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, which I know to our listeners over here sounds like recognizing that there's a sky is blue and, and we breathe air. Mm-hmm. But countries around the world, there are very few that recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel for their political reasons. So Sharren, is it really going to happen? And explain the significance if it does.
Well, I certainly hope so. So we don't have a full confirmation yet, but Prime Minister Morrison is considering it, which I do believe that more and more countries slowly will move their embassies to Jerusalem. It's going to take probably quite a bit of a process, but it will happen. And you know what? I'm not surprised that it's happening, with Australia. We have such a strong relationship and friendship, a historical friendship with Australia. In the past few years, we have really reinforced the economical friendship between us as well. The Chamber of Commerce Israel-Australia has been bringing at least 2 delegations a month of businessmen to come and invest in Israel, buy companies. So, our relationships are really, really getting stronger. And on the diplomatic aspect, I mean, when we know that when Scott Morrison was elected, we know he's an evangelical Christian. We know the attitude of the evangelical Christian community towards the Jewish people, towards Israel. We have such a strong friendship and such a strong bond between us that, in the greeting letter that I sent Prime Minister Scott Morrison, I also mentioned a request to move the embassy. And you know what? There's such a big lobby in parliament members and senators in Australia who have been advocating for that as well. For example, Senator Patterson, who his maiden speech in the Senate was all about moving the embassy of Australia to Jerusalem. So on that aspect, we do have quite a lot of friends. Through the friendship groups, I continue to mention it. I've sent numerous letters to the foreign ministries and to different parliament members to move the embassy. So I really think it's just a natural kind of move to actually do that. It wasn't declared yet, but I really hope that in the next few weeks we'll get some really good news about it.
So just to clarify, right now we're talking just about recognizing Jerusalem as the capital, not moving the embassy yet, which would be a further step, obviously, in the right direction. Now, the most recent development that they reported on the radio here 20 minutes ago was that 13 Arab ambassadors to Australia met together and decided to do a whole campaign to prevent this from happening. from your knowledge of Australian politics and the pro-Israel movement in Australia, can we win?
I do think so. Look, obviously the current of the mood of the anti-Israel movement that we see, like so strongly in Europe and in some places in North America, definitely South America as well. It didn't skip Australia, and you do have certain movements like that as well also in Australia, mainly in a state called New South Wales. Where over there it's a little bit more vocal than any other state.
Where Sydney is.
Yeah, that's where Sydney is, exactly. In general, though, usually Australians are not that interested in foreign policies. So they usually concentrate much more on internal issues. But obviously in Israel you hear a lot, you hear about it as well, as not as much as you would hear it obviously in Europe, but you do hear about it. I'm sure there's going to be people that are going to push and put a lot of pressure for this not to happen. But we have really good friends there. We have a strong Jewish community there as well. And obviously, with the growing understanding of the good forces around the Middle East that are trying to combat a lot of countries and powers, very aggressive ones, who are trying to destabilize our region. Most parliamentarians, most groups, most people understand that Israel is part of the good forces who actually stabilize the Middle East. And in light of this truth, I think that's why we get a lot of support from the Australian people too.
Okay, so I'd like to segue from there to internal Israeli politics, because Netanyahu became the first Israeli sitting prime minister to visit Australia, as well as the first Israeli sitting prime minister to visit Latin America, and been to Africa a couple times, been welcomed all around the world. So we can argue that diplomatically things are going very well for Israel, and we both sat there and listened to Netanyahu speak for 45 minutes yesterday.
And I might just interrupt and just mention as well that yesterday we had a big win as well at the International Parliamentarian Union, where a few Muslim countries were trying to push an emergency item about UNRWA and about condemning withdrawing funds from UNRWA. And countries, even like Holland and Norway and many more countries, have voted against this resolution after we advocate for it in this organization, me and Nachman Shai, together. And we were able to drop this emergency item because a lot of the countries were voting against it with us.
Wonderful, great accomplishments. So we've got a government with great diplomatic accomplishments. Netanyahu went on about the economic accomplishments yesterday. The security he went into less than he normally does. But if everything's going so well for Netanyahu, why doesn't he go initiate an election now in order to get another mandate from his people for 4 more years?
Because we see first the interest of the people of Israel. And every election in Israel costs millions and millions of shekels, taxpayers' money that can be invested in so many good reforms and in so many good things here in Israel. And if there is no reason to go into early election, I'm sure, as you know, Gil, as well, on average, we have every 2.5 years election instead of every 4 years. I mean, try and imagine that. Almost we double the amount of election and money spent on elections. So if we can actually wait and hold with this election and save a lot of money on it, we should do that. If there's a good reason to go into elections, then we should. But, we're not just going to go because right now we're on the poll with a really high amount of mandate. Obviously, it will work in our benefits, but first of all, we will think about the taxpayers.
So you think that the current government could last until November 2019, completing a term in office, becoming the first government in Israel to complete a term in office since 1988, when I think you were just born?
Well, that would have really been nice, and it would be really good to sort of break this record as well. I think it would be also important, but also understanding the political reality in Israel, I won't bet on it. So let's take, if the elections would be on their time, it would be November 2019, right? By the Likud and Labor as well constitution, I think Labor is different, but with the Likud constitution, if we need to create primaries and prime elections into our party 6 months prior to that.
Really?
Which means that the Likud primaries are going to be around March or April, if they are going to be on their time. I believe that once we've had the primaries, that's already a reason to destabilize a lot of the political situation in the Likud party and also outside. Once we already know what's the next list of the Likud, people will come with demands. There's going to be instability. And my assessment would be that probably after a month or two, we're probably going to go into elections because of that. So I would probably try and put my guess on May or June to have the elections.
You heard it, ladies and gentlemen, and she's not just your average person on the street. You sat there in the Likud faction meeting with Netanyahu. I'm sure yesterday people must have been asking him behind closed doors when there were no reporters, what are you doing? When are you doing? And I take it that he hasn't revealed the secret to you, but this seems to be a very good educated guess.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you.
So thank you for coming here on Inside Israel today on the Land of Israel Network, and for making our show much more interesting.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be on your show.
That was Sharren Haskel, member of Knesset from the Likud Party, and the head of the Israel-Australia Friendship League in the Knesset. And she's actually, for trivia here, ladies and gentlemen, the first Canadian-born member of Knesset that we have had in decades. So after the break, we will be speaking more about what's going on in local politics here in Israel. Stay with us.
Awake, tribe of Judah, calls Zev Jabotinsky. Nature beckons with the spring. Passover beckons, the day of Exodus, liberation from our chains. Well, I'm definitely looking for a little bit of liberation, and frankly, even a healthy dose of redemption, because I'm Rav Mike Feuer, and this is The Jewish Story.
Join Rav Mike Feuer for the best Jewish history podcast, The Jewish Story, on the Land of Israel Network at thelandofisrael.com.
And we're back here on Inside Israel Today on the Land of Israel Network, on the landofisrael.com. And in the first half of the show, I think you heard a nice insider's view of when our election could be. I've been saying all along that it'll be sometime at the end of February or the beginning of March, in part because we have local elections on the 30th of October, and then the 13th of November would be a runoff race here in Jerusalem among the top two finishers, and only after those races are done can they really go about dispersing the Knesset and initiating a general election. But perhaps this government will last a little bit longer. But there are limits, as Sharren Haskel points out, that the Likud has two different ways of running its primary. What it normally does is, as soon as an election is initiated, an election for Knesset, they have an emergency primary, and the emergency is the norm. They do it as soon as possible after the elections are initiated. But there's actually a rule that nobody seems to know, that she pointed out exclusively to my listeners over here, which is that when the elections are held on time, then they're supposed to have the Likud primary a whole 6 months before. I don't know how good her math was over there by talking about doing it in March or April, but May would be 6 months before November. And that would be a very big mess. You would have a full 6 months of chaos, and I can understand why you would not want to have the election on time if you have that. And so, ladies and gentlemen, our job is to try to figure out when Netanyahu will initiate this election. And over the last few days, Netanyahu has been dropping more and more hints. And we at the Jerusalem Post have been, I guess, prophetic or whatever. We have the lead headline to Yisrael Hayom, the newspaper closest to Netanyahu, today is actually the exact words of the sub-lead headline of the Jerusalem Post from the day before, which is, Netanyahu, I don't need an excuse to go to elections. Now, this is something that he said yesterday, but he also said it the day before. Netanyahu is saying that all those who are saying that the election would be decided based on one particular controversial piece of legislation, which is the enlistment bill for the ultra-Orthodox, are wrong, that he can pass that bill and then decide to go to an election whenever he wants. He doesn't need a reason for it. And while that is not normally true, normally he does need a reason. If the elections are so close anyway, people aren't going to say, as Sharren said, oh, this is a waste of money, if we're having it 6 to 8 months before the regular date, as opposed to 2-3 years before when they would say it. Now, one thing that's the ultimate sign that elections are on the way is what's happened over the last week, which is that Netanyahu is speaking to the press. Now, I know that probably sounds funny if you live in America or Canada or England or Australia, where the politicians speak to the press all the time. Netanyahu speaks to the press when it helps him to speak to the press. When does it help him to speak to the press? Only when there's an election on the way. Netanyahu has decided he doesn't like the press. He'd rather go around the press, evade the press, be his own press by speaking directly to the public through Facebook and Twitter. And so he did not give an interview the entire term to any media outlet. One to Channel 20, which is a right-wing television station that was formed that is really a media outlet that just parrots whatever he says and tries to make him look good. But other than that, no interviews at all, as opposed to ahead of the last election. He gave interviews nonstop to every media outlet possible. I had a long interview with him. Before that, I had an off-record one-on-one with him, which I don't get when there's not an election coming up. The satire television show Eretz Nehederet mocked Netanyahu, suddenly giving interviews to everyone by showing him give an interview to Hello Kitty for the Hello Kitty television show. So now, suddenly, a week ago, when they had an announcement, a press conference, in theory, for the introduction of the candidate to head the Bank of Israel, they said that Netanyahu would take 2 questions and the finance minister Moshe Kachlon would take 2 questions. And after Netanyahu's first 2 questions and there were no questions for Kachlon, he said, you know what? I've got time. I'll take as many questions as you want. He even dared the media. Go call your office and see if they have any embarrassing questions for me. I'm ready. Now, this was a very big change after Netanyahu had been resisting talking to the press for so long. Now, it could very well be that it was because that morning, the most popular radio show here on Army Radio of Razi Bar-Kai interviewed Ehud Barak, and Ehud Barak said that it was delusional that we have a prime minister who doesn't give interviews, Barak being a former prime minister himself. So Netanyahu decided, as we say in Hebrew, to be dafka. And you say, I'm not giving interviews. You say, I'm not speaking to the media. Well, now I'm going to speak to the media for as long as they want. And yesterday, after Netanyahu delivered his speech to the opening session of the Knesset, a couple hours after that, he actually went into the cafeteria of the Knesset, which is something he rarely does. He even came in with Sarah, his wife, and he said, I can take questions. And so there were, I personally had gone home by then, but there were a few different political reporters there who asked him about elections, who asked him about the conscription bill for the ultra-Orthodox, and he gave some answers, which he didn't even do during his big speech to the Knesset. So, look, it's looking more and more like elections are on the way and that they're going to be a lot of fun. Now, that brings me a good segue to the elections that we know are on the way, which is the municipal elections, which will be held 2 weeks from today, ladies and gentlemen. October 30th, it's really happening. We're really there. After covering these elections day in and day out in the Jerusalem Post, I'm looking forward to it coming. It's been a lot of fun, particularly the elections in Jerusalem and in Beit Shemesh. Beit Shemesh is a community that has a lot of English speakers who moved from the United States and Canada, and their election is quite fateful. Their election is between their reigning incumbent mayor, Moshe Abutbul, an ultra-Orthodox mayor from the Sephardi Shas party, and a woman named Eliza Bloch, who is a high school principal, an educator, a woman, and I interviewed last week for Friday's Jerusalem Post, and it was very impressive. We spoke for about an hour. The entire hour, she unveiled a long, in-depth platform about what she would do to help English speakers in Beit Shemesh. She came to the interview very ready, and I got to say, it was very impressive. I've been in touch with Moshe Abutbul about having an interview with him too. We are fair at the Jerusalem Post. I don't think the interview would be in English with him. He doesn't seem to know English, and that's okay. But we will be giving him his equal time. Now, for me, what made the interview with Eliza Bloch more interesting was that it came immediately after an interview that I had with one of the leading candidates for mayor of Jerusalem, Moshe Leon. Now, Moshe Leon, unlike Eliza Bloch, came to the interview very, very unprepared. I interview a lot of politicians, and usually they come to the interview with a lot to say, whereas Moshe Leon seemed to be very careful, seemed to be like he didn't want to say anything, that he saw the interview with the Jerusalem Post as kind of not something that would help him very much, and I would understand that. I don't know how many readers the Jerusalem Post still has in Jerusalem. An overwhelming majority of our readers are online, and among the readers that we have here, they perhaps would be looking for a candidate who would be more worldly than Moshe Leon. Moshe Leon believes that he will be elected by the Sephardi ultra-Orthodox people in Jerusalem who support Shas, and the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox people who support the Degel HaTorah party, along with some Sephardi, not ultra-Orthodox people, people who call themselves traditional. And those are not the people who read the Jerusalem Post. But you would have thought that he would have made more of an effort to try to reach out to new people who could vote for him and perhaps give him the votes necessary to put him over the top and make that two-man runoff race against the leading candidate in the polls, Ofer Berkovich. It's going to be either Elkin, our Minister of Jerusalem Affairs, Zev Elkin, or Moshe Leon in that runoff race. And really every vote counts. So if you are asked a question like, what will you do as mayor to help English speakers in Jerusalem? The correct answer is not, you guys are set, you're doing fine, I will help French people instead. But that is what he said. And when you're giving an interview to the Jerusalem Post, it's not very wise to say that you would never set foot in a Reform synagogue. I mean, a lot of our readers around the world go to Reform synagogues. You don't have to maybe admit that you wouldn't set foot in a Reform synagogue. You can believe it. You can keep it to yourself. You can say in a very respectful way, I'm just going to be respectful to everyone, and we have a diverse population in Jerusalem, and I respect that. And bypass the question. Politicians know how to bypass questions. But he did not. He said things that he should have known would be seen by our readers as something that would turn them away. as something that would distance them. At a certain point during the interview, I thought, wow, he thinks he has this election won already. He feels that he doesn't need the people who read the Jerusalem Post. I even felt at certain points was begging the readers of the Jerusalem Post not to vote for him. And even not specific readers of the Jerusalem Post, but in general, I hope he doesn't answer a question this way when he's talking to other media outlets. I said to him, a week before, there was a column in Yediot Achronot, one of the largest circulation newspapers in Israel, by Sivan Rahav Meir, one of the most respected journalists in Israel, where she wrote, the media are not covering that election in Jerusalem the right way. They're covering the mudslinging, and they're not covering the policies and the plans for picking up the mud in Jerusalem, for cleaning the garbage, which is really what you're looking for in a mayor. And so Zev Elkin heard what she wrote, or read what she wrote, and called up all the reporters covering the election and spoke to us for a full hour about what his platform was. And I wrote it in the following day's paper. So I said, Moshe, Elkin spoke about these 6 issues. Give me your platform on these 6 issues. And he said, my plan is the same as Elkin's. Are you kidding me? That's the way you answer a question? I give you an opportunity to explain your platform on the key issues of the day in Jerusalem, economic development, housing, again, cleaning up that garbage, education, how to keep young families in the city, and your answer is, I'll do what he's doing. I'll have what she's having, as the famous quote is from When Harry Met Sally. Look, you're being given time to talk to the readers, to explain to them why they should vote for you. If you are asked simple questions, not hard questions like, your opponents say that you're corrupt. How do I know you're not going to be corrupt? I'm asking you easy questions. I think that the readers deserve to have some answers. And perhaps if you would care enough to know how to help the English speakers in Jerusalem and what their problems are, perhaps you could read the interview that I had with Eliza Bloch, the candidate in Beit Shemesh, just an hour later. Look, ladies and gentlemen, we're not going to give opinions here on Inside Israel Today on who to vote for and how to vote for, but you should be aware of what's going on behind the scenes here and how politicians are relating to the readers in the Jerusalem Post and also to the listeners here on Inside Israel Today. Thank you for being here with us on another exciting edition of Inside Israel Today on the Land of Israel Network, on thelandofisrael.com. We will have another exciting show from here in Jerusalem a week from now. Have a great day and a great week from Jerusalem. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Torah thoughts and inspiration from the heartland of Israel. Tune in every week to The Soul of Israel with Rabbi Shlomo Katz on the Land of Israel Network at thelandofisrael.com.